Well, thank you very much for joining me in this video. I want to talk to you today about implied agency. I had a salesperson come into me the other day and she said, I just listed a property exclusively, but I've got my own buyer. She said, I'm looking forward to double ending it, but I don't want to get into dual agency, so I'm going to have the buyer be a customer rather than a client. Can I do that? I said, well, the seller is obviously a client. You've got them under contract, and whether it's a exclusive or MLS doesn't even enter into it. But I said, as long as the customer, that you're the buyer, has not signed a buyer agency representation agreement, and as long as you've gone over principles of agency and they understand exactly what's at stake, then yes, they can be a customer. But you need to be very, very careful. You know, it used to be years and years ago, the whole industry was on something called sub-agency, and buyers were always customers. And when it swung over to the right approach of buyers being represented as well as sellers, RICO came out with a position that said in order for a buyer to be a client rather than a customer, they must sign a buyer representation agreement. And I was real concerned about this. In fact, I met with them a few occasions. I had lunch with a fellow who was the chairman of the committee, and I said, you got to be careful. That's not right. Well, what do you mean? I said, you're going to get into unintended dual agency. You're going to get into implied agency. Because you see, under the common law of agency, if I am advising somebody, or even if I'm not, but they are relying on me, you've got unintended agency being created. Got to be very, very careful. When you are an agent for a particular client, you owe them a number of duties. Two of the duties that come to mind that are very, very important is confidentiality and full disclosure. Confidentiality says anything that they say, you're going to keep to yourself unless they give you the express consent to tell somebody. And full disclosure says anything that you hear that could impact their decision in the selling of their property, you're going to tell them. Well, as soon as you get into double ending, if they're both clients, you've got a conflicting problem. You can say, well, whatever you say, I'll tell them. Whatever they say, I'll tell you. Well, that's fine. Now you've got the disclosure part taken care of, but what about the confidentiality part? What they tell you, you got to keep confidential. But what they tell you, you got to tell them. So it's an impossible situation. And so with dual agency, the trade-off is that nothing is confidential except how high you'll go or how low you'll take. But it's critically important that both parties understand this, and that's why it's important to go through the principles of agency, have them sign off on it, and have them also sign off when it gets into a dual agency situation. Now, it doesn't really limit them, because if another agent was bringing in the offer, you wouldn't know any information about the buyer anyway. So it doesn't really disadvantage the seller, but you've got some obligations to him or her that you can't fulfill under the common law of agency. What I'm concerned about, though, here today, is when you're working with a customer. Now, you've explained all this to the buyer. He understands client, he understands customer, at least you told him. But he really doesn't. And I saw this all the time when we were on sub-agency, and that's why I disliked sub-agency so much. They'll ask a question like, well, is their asking price realistic? Well, can you show me some comparables and give me an idea of what the price should be? And then they'll say, well, what do you think they will take? Or better yet, they'll say, well, you know, I'll go in at 560, but if I have to, I'll go up to 570. They've forgotten the whole conversation you had with them about agency, confidentiality, and full disclosure. You see, you now have to tell your seller, well, listen, they're coming in at 560, but they told me they'd go to 570 or 575, full disclosure. They wouldn't tell you if they realized that, but they forget. I remember back under the days of sub-agency, we had an agent come in from another firm one time, and they were bringing in an offer, and they said, well, we're working for the seller. Never met the seller. It was under sub-agency. But they said, my daughter's my customer. But in the offer, they had all kinds of warranties that they were requiring the seller to make, and they were requiring the seller, at their own expense, to do a survey. And I said, you know, that's not the norm in the industry to have the seller do a survey because the buyer wants financing. And they said, well, yeah, I know, but it's my daughter. They missed the whole idea of who you're working for and where your obligations lie. And it's really easy to get that way today. And it's really easy to get that way in the mind of the buyer, even though you've gone over it with you. And he's going to ask you some of these questions. So You've got to stress to them what your duties are, and you've got the obligation to disclose to the seller, and the only obligation to the customer is to be fair, treat them fairly. And it's really, really easy to stray over the line and get into unintended dual agency. They start sharing with you their finances. They start sharing with you all kinds of things. I mean, these days when somebody represents the buyer, that buyer can say to you, I'm going to put in 2 offers, often the lower one, but if you have to, in competition, bring out the higher one. Well, you could never do that when they're a customer. So where it really becomes critical is with a new act coming in, the Truth in Real Estate Services Act, which will take effect the 1st of December. Here they say we're getting rid of customers. No such thing as a customer. What they're calling it instead is a personally represented individual. And it depends on how much they promote this, how extensive it's going to be. They're also dealing with this business about commission, and you've got to go over with the seller. What happens to the commission if it's a co-broke? What happens to the commission if it's a self-represented individual? Well, if they say all that, you're going to have people saying, well, I want to represent myself because I want that portion of the commission. And they're not going to understand how easy it is for them to get into a client relationship. You've got to, because they allow you to show the property and they allow you to draft the offer. Now, once you're drafting the offer, you've got things like if it's conditional on sale of property, whether you've got an escape clause, you've got all kinds of things in there that you're going to start advising them about because they don't know how to fill out an offer. And as you advise them and they rely on your advice, it's agency. So you're going to have to be very, very careful about what you do in terms of not getting into an implied agency situation and not getting into an unintended dual agency situation. So in each situation you work with, give real careful thought. Are they a customer? Are they a client? And what are my duties under each? Hope that makes sense. Thank you for investing your time. Talk to you again next week.